My first slide is this quote by Paul Samuelson, who is probably the best economist since the war. He's passed away now, unfortunately. And he says that comparative advantage, the notion of why do we trade in the first place? What is this whole thing about? Why do we even care about our neighbouring countries? And it's really based on this idea of comparative advantage. And he came out with this quote saying, and if he excludes the gender bias in it, that thousands of important, intelligent men, even when they explain the theory of comparative advantage, A, they still don't understand it, and B, even if they do understand it, they just don't believe it. And so I'm going to try and explain why most people don't believe it, and you can make your own mind up whether you believe it or not. The idea is, in comparative advantage, that all countries through trade, no matter how much of a basket case a country might be, all of them can gain. So, okay, that's already a bit of a suspension of disbelief in many of your minds. The second part of it is that everybody in those countries can be at least as well off. At least as well off. In other words, no worse off from engaging in trade. Now, that should sound a bit like a free lunch. And the weird thing is, it is. So when people say there's no such thing as a free lunch, actually, comparative advantage does give you a free lunch. So this quote by Samuelson of people don't quite believe it probably rings true to some of you. Now, one of the important things is, what are the conditions you require in order for this to hold, right? So it sounds like just apple pie, but what do you need to make this thing hold? And that's the bit that really doesn't get talked about. The first thing it means that you have, of course you have winners and losers, of course you do. But the point is that if the winners redistribute towards the losers, that's why you can make everybody no worse off. In other words, by the time you've compensated the losers, then there's still going to be some people who've won. That's why it's a free lunch. Now, the interesting question is, have we actually done this redistribution? And the second question for me is, how do you do this redistribution? And by the way, economists have very little to say about these questions, which is why it's so interesting. And I actually have a lot of sympathy with the current government and actually business people, because this is tough stuff. And it's not like economists have spent years mapping this out. They haven't. So, redistribution. First of all, in my view, there's been 3 anti-establishment votes. We're all forgetting Scotland, right? Don't forget Scotland. It's got some great lessons. Scotland, okay, it didn't vote to leave the UK, but it came damn close. It came close. It didn't even know what currency it was going to use, right? I mean, it's got nothing to do with economics. They didn't even know what currency it was going to use, and they still nearly voted for it. And the amazing thing is, Scotland gets a transfer from the rest of the UK, which makes it, in terms of income, exactly as wealthy, or exactly the same per capita income as the rest of the UK. Hey, what's not to like? We give you the money. Because that sort of transfer, getting a check in the post, that actually doesn't please people. They want a life, and they want a life for their kids. But unfortunately, regional development is something we haven't really done in this country for a long time. We even stopped this great book called Regional Trends that the National Statistics Office used to produce. About 15 years, we closed it down because we thought nobody was reading it. So how do you help different regions in the country? Not something we've done a great deal of. This is probably the most centralised nation, our United Kingdom, of all the leading nations in the world. Second, Brexit was a vote which was anti-establishment and went through. And of course now it's a US presidential election. And we're thinking about businesses, just hold your horses, it's not finished yet. You've got quite a few other shoes that could easily drop. This is not a UK phenomenon, it's bigger than that. The autumn statement yesterday, I think Brexit, the real underlying part of it, and the last speaker, I sort of recognised some of the feelings towards economists. I think economists talk about things like GDP a little bit too much, and they don't talk about distribution, which is actually what trade, whether it's capital or labour or goods or services, the first order effect is actually on distribution, but we don't talk enough about it. It's not really something economists have really focused on, and we need to do it much more. So what are the issues? Probably persistent inequality. It's not recent, it's been going on for the last 25 years. Persistent inequality, regional disparities. I mean, I'm from Newcastle, and the per capita output in Newcastle is less than half, and it's the same country than in London. low productivity. We've actually been pretty bad at this for about the last decade, but also compared to our peer nations. The Autumn Statement, did it change any of those? Of course not. Mind you, it's pretty hard to do this sort of stuff, and we need to do some really proper thinking about what does a real industrial strategy mean. Unfortunately, I don't think it means fiddling around with taxes. That's not the way to actually really affect things in the long run. So what are the sort of ambitions and issues, the challenges going to face us? The first one is we have 3 sets of trade negotiations. By far our most important one is going to be with the EU. Then we have the other free trade agreements that Europe has that we'll be excluded from or not part of. And then the WTO. I'm sure Thomas has touched on these, so I'll be fairly quick. But 3 separate types of trade negotiations we're going to have to carry out. Distance is one of those weird things, and I keep talking to MPs. On the way up here, I was having a call with a Labour MP, actually, who was saying, well, we can go and do this trade with somebody else. And it's like, look, this is pretty basic stuff. We tend to trade most with the people who are close beside us. So Ireland I think, is our 5th biggest trading partner. Ireland's tiny as a nation. With the greatest respect to Ireland, it's a small place. But we trade a lot with them because they're next door. And so we find that, when we think about Mrs. May was in India a couple of weeks ago, if she struck the free trade agreement of all time, and I mean all time, and it increased by 25%, our exports to India, let's just pretend, and no trade deal's ever done this, by the way, but let's just pretend, that's equivalent to 1% of our trade with the EU. EU is what matters in terms of size because it's close. That's pretty much it. Now, an interesting fact about this is, a lot of people about 20 years ago said, actually, distance is going to stop being important. But funnily enough, it looks like distance is becoming more important. One of the reasons it's becoming more important is because production chains, businesses are doing much more of their intermediate business by exporting to other countries. So this is the iconic iPhone 4. And you can see, of course, all iPhones are made in China, right? It says at the back. And my iPhone cost me, I don't know, about £600, £700 or something like that. It's quite expensive. $10 of that is made in China. And the company that makes them is actually owned by the Taiwanese. So yes, it's got the stamp on, and yes, it came out of the factory in the end. But look where all the component parts come from. They come from all different parts of the world. And so businesses break up the production chain much more. And why this matters is because most of these companies, you do the production chains are nearby. They're not on the opposite side of the world. And that's why distance, if anything, matters more rather than less. Another issue to look at is, do you look at our export and trade by total exports? That's the things that everybody always focuses on. Or do you care about the amount of British value added in those exports, the amount of British jobs that went into them? Well, you probably care about the jobs and the income. That's a guess. Left-hand side, the left-hand side shows the share of exports of goods versus services in terms of just gross headline figures that everybody always focuses on. 6% are goods. But if you took it in terms of value added, domestic income and domestic jobs, the overwhelming proportion are services. We export services. So all this stuff about tariffs, it doesn't really count for services. That's about non-tariff barriers. So I just wish we could change the debate a bit. When we look at industries, we don't export everything, and neither should we, because the richer the countries get, they specialise. And what do we specialise in? This is our exports by domestic value added. Domestic value added is a shorthand way of saying by the amount of income, employment and profits that are generated and stay in the UK. That's what it's getting at. That's what we should care about. And our first 5 bars make up all the domestic value from all the other sectors added up together. Business services, financial services, wholesale and retail trade, transport and telecommunications, plus IT, and chemicals. By far our most important sector. So if we're going to have an industrial strategy, I hope we don't start giving subsidies to Nissan as a sort of matter of routine, because they're not actually doing much for British jobs. look, and I know they're in Sunderland. I'm coming from Newcastle, apart from the football rivalry. We have the greatest. I really do believe in regional development, but please do it in a strategic way. One of the other issues we're going to have to consider, and for businessmen, is, okay, we're not going to be in the EU anymore, no longer under the European Court of Justice. Well, you need to have a judicial system which allows you to decide when you have a dispute with your neighbour, because disputes happen. Under the EU, we're under the ECJ, they have about 1,700 cases a year, and it's fantastic, and I mean this for businesses. You can go on this website called Solve It, and it tells you about manufacturers in England who sell stuff to Germany and how they sue them if they break a contract. It's easy, you can put it in through the website. So small business can use these courts. This is exactly where they go to. If you don't go to the ECJ, then you can use the EFTA, or the European Free Trade Area Court. They get about 26 cases a year, but it's only 3 countries, so not bad. If you don't want to do either of those two and you go back to WTO, well, they do 25 cases a year amongst 160 countries. Well, if you think your company is going to be first in line for Britain, it better be big. And even then, it's going to take you 10 years. So there's not much of a dispute settlement system. So what do you do if you don't want to go to WTO? Well, you go for an investor-state dispute settlement, an ISDS. Now, this is the things the Wallonians in Belgium, this is what they complained about. And as soon as they raised it and said, hang on, we don't like this, now the Canadians don't like it. Why? Because people think there's something undemocratic about a business being able to sue a government, but a government not being able to sue a business. They kind of don't think that rings true. But that's what most of these free trade agreements these days are having as their extraterritorial judicial system. That debate hasn't happened yet. And when you tell a government minister this, their face goes white, because they know they're going to have to come back and talk to the electorate about it. Thank you very much.